human communication is not aimed at optimal informational transactions.
Yes. Bruno Galantucci seems to have lost the mouse. Good afternoon, everybody. Do you know how to get the mouse back?
It's complicated. Try going consistently in one direction. There we go.
Oh, thank you. All right.
I think you can use this.
Yes, no, thank you. I think as we go.
I have your own.
Yes. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I believe that there is a widespread underlying assumption in the field of people who study human communication. And I will spell it out here. I call it the faithfulness assumption. And that is that humans communicate so as to have a reasonable expectation that the informational exchanges they perform are faithful. I used to believe in this assumption, and I think if you sample an audience in the right way, you'll see that most of the audiences and most conferences I've been to believe in this. And there is good reason to believe in this, because it's an intuitive assumption and it's consistent with obvious fact. I don't think that we would like to get into a surgery room or on a flight if we didn't believe that humans are capable of performing faithful informational exchanges. On a larger scale, I don't think it will make sense to have social institutions such as stock market these days are running the world if we didn't believe that as a community we are able to perform a large number of faithful transactions. And indeed, if you look in the field, of course, this is an idea that is lingering in many scholars, Shannon and Weaver to begin with, their mathematical model of communication, but also in linguists such as Hackett, his idea of semanticity, in philosophers such as Grice, his principle of cooperation, in psychology such as Clark and Gibbs, the principle of mutual responsibility, which is connected to the principle of cooperation, and so on and so forth. These are the places where it's a little bit more easy to see this assumption, which is often hidden, but I think it's in many more other places. Of course, there are places where this assumption is relaxed, is not challenged. For example, the work of the anthropology Malinowski, who points out that there are a number of interactions that we do that do not actually abide by this kind of assumption. He calls them moments of phatic communion. Notice that he changes the name. This is not a communication moment, it is a moment of communion in which the establishment and the maintenance of a social pleasant relation is more important than the faithfulness of the exchange. But this is not really a problem for this kind of assumption, because all we need to do is to limit the scope of this assumption and saying, well, when you're not in a phatic mode, then this assumption will. Yet, there are more problematic things for this kind of assumption. For example, human communication often fails. If you go out there in the world and measure how often people miscommunicate, like Zane has done, a linguist, you'll find that there is quite a bit. You can find it also in the lab, like Boaz Kieser has done a wonderful work on this. And we actually discovered, that's how I stumbled onto this idea first. We were doing this work on experimental semiotics. We have people that invent a language in the lab. We discovered some of them are really terrible at doing this. And this is another talk. So you can read more if you're interested in this paper. We highlight some of these problems. So I think it is time for us to start testing this hypothesis in the lab. In particular, we took this hypothesis and two main entailments that it has. One is that people should detect problematic exchanges in linguistic interaction. If you want to maintain faithfulness, you have to detect when it fails. On the other hand, when you detect that it fails, you should attempt to resolve these problems. We started with the first entailment. In particular, we asked whether, once we insert systematic problems into a conversation, people will notice them. The method was very simple. It was me and Garrett Roberts there. We had a pair of participants coming to the lab, and they were in different locations of the lab. Each one of them was seeing a different version of the same cartoon with these famous people like Einstein and the Queen there of England. These cartoons are colored differently, and these people are having a conversation over instant messaging in order to find out as many color differences as possible in 50 minutes of time. Very simple communication task here. At the same time, in another part of the lab, we have another pair who's doing the same task with different cartoons, with different people in them. What we do, once in a while, we do what we call the swap patches. We play tricks. That is, we cross the lines. We get messages from, let's say, a participant B2, and instead of sending it to B1, we send it to A1. And of course, vice versa, from one to B1. And the same we do for the other pair. The participants here don't see this because they don't have names here. They just see the lines keep coming like you and partner. Right? So this is very opaque to them, this manipulation. After this, there were 4 of these swap pages, by the way. Each one of them is 30 seconds. So you have a total of 2 minutes of swap conversation over 15 minutes. Soon after they end this conversation, we do an interview, like using a standard methodology that's been used for inattentional blindness, for example, a final questionnaire. We start with a very generic question, like how did you find the conversation, and so on and so forth. The 5th question was really the key one, in which we were telling the participant the design of the experiment, and that was that you could be in 1 or 2 groups. If you were in the swap group, then we cross your conversation. If you were not in the swap group, then your line was always stable. You talked to the same person throughout all of the experiment. Which group do you think you were in? And by the way, we rewarded a correct guess by $3, which for our participants is quite a bit of money. Okay? Now, here are the results. So we have chance level at 50-50, right? You have to choose either you are in a swap group or not. That's where we are. Not very far from chance level, and very far from absolute detection, which what you would expect from the faithfulness assumption. We started puzzling about this. I was hoping for something like this, but not this big. And we wonder, well, maybe this is because they talk about colors. Each pair is talking about colors, so if you cross this conversation where they're talking about colors, it's hard to notice. So we had another set of pairs, and they were doing the same task, but now instead of spotting color differences, they would discuss which of these people they would like to spend a weekend with and which one they would not like to spend a weekend with. You can imagine these are New Yorkers. They would have very, very lively conversation about these things, and certainly very different kind of conversation. Doesn't make a difference. As a matter of fact, we replicated this study in a situation in which instead of crossing the conversation that creates some sort of a chaotic mixing, we systematically intercepted some messages and inserted some message of our own, where we could actually be sure of the kind of incoherence that we would throw in this conversation. It doesn't matter. Now we have 102 participants. Overall, they are barely above chance, and certainly way far from absolute detection. Then we thought, well, maybe this is connected to instant messaging. Instant message is a notorious chaotic means of communication. If you've ever been on a chat group, you know. And even when you're 2 people, it's hard to keep track of all the threads, the timing, and so on and so forth. So we should really test this thing in face-to-face, kind of the litmus test of a theory on human communication. And we started, that was actually crazy, we started with something quite crazy, which was we had a pair of participants coming to the lab, and they would play a very simple game, which was we gave them 5 would you rather questions, like would you rather live for the rest of your life on a tree or on a cave, or in a cave. These are conversation starters, and you can imagine 2 New Yorkers talking about 5 of them. They have to rank them in order how funny they are, how difficult they are to answer. A very lively conversation. After 8 minutes of this conversation, one of the participants, who's actually a confederate of the lab, will utter this sentence that probably you've seen before. We call her as the curious. Now we went crazy. We didn't want just to create an incoherence. We wanted to do it with a meaningless message. This is famous because it's well structured but meaningless, right? Well, let's have a look at the results. They're actually, well, they're not far from chance, but they are the worst results we've had so far. We actually thought that face-to-face would have a higher better kind of detection, it turns out it's worse. Now, of course, there are other differences, so it's difficult to compare, but this is what we get. So, where are we in the assessment of this assumption? If you look at the first entailment, big question mark. What about the other? Well, we didn't publish this stuff, but we actually had footage of the moment in which the sentence colorism ideas was uttered. You will imagine that when you hear something like this, you will initiate what in conversation analysis is called a repair, an other initiated repair. You repair this problematic term. And some people actually did this, right?
What?
No, it's okay.
See, she uttered the sentence and he is trying to like, let me play it once more.
What?
Right? That's what you would expect, right?
It's okay.
He actually insists, she's instructed to just let it go and kind of like diffuse the situation.
Yeah.
Well, we saw a few of those, but for the most, we saw very strange things.
You never played Would You Rather?
College ideas give you this. You never play Would You Rather? Or, now this is, we need to, if possible, raise the volume.
Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation.
See, now she's noticed, she laughs, she says, well, okay, so let's go on. We saw even worse.
Yeah, that will come back. Yeah. I was going to use it furiously.
Yeah. Just sent into it. What is going on? What is going on? Well, so I think we should put a big question mark there too. But there are some problems with these studies, and they've been pointed out by my friend Nicholas here and his colleagues. And this is that for this study, well, these were very casual conversations, as I mentioned. So the possibility that you're in a fake mode there, which is sort of an exception to that kind of assumption, could be real. Also, the first study, as a matter of fact, is not watertight because people might have detected the problem and then forget. Now, this is something that we know from inattentional blindness doesn't happen very often. And I believe of the 60 or so cases that we've seen on non-detection, these two possibilities will not explain them all. But we agree with Fee et al. That a thorough test of these assumptions should actually take into account these two things. So we ran a study, which actually was done independently. It happened earlier than this paper, in which we addressed the first concern by having people executing instructions by being watched. Right? A very sort of like structured kind of conversation. At the same time, we observed the immediate reaction, not the questionnaire that you saw before, but the kind of clips that you just saw. Just see what happens there. It was a very simple task. There were two participants. Again, one of them was actually a Confederate. They were watched by an experimenter, and the Confederate will ask things such, please pick up the key and then move it to F3. In between the participant and the Confederate, there was a chessboard. In front of the participant was that tray with objects, and the participant will pick up the key and move it to F3. All good. After a number of these mundane turns, we have a critical instruction in which the Confederate is going to ask, please pick up the SCAS and move it to C5. Now we have two problems with this. The first is that SCAS is a known word that we invented. It doesn't have a meaning by definition. The second is that if you look at this tray, all of these objects have well-known names. There's a lighter, a button, a key, a candle, but two of them don't have it. So even if you want to infer the meaning of this word SCAS, which one is it? Well, if you work in a hardware store, maybe you know the names, but most of the people, actually all the people we asked this previously, didn't know. So, again, you would expect a repair, something like this.
The SCAS, can we move it to C5?
And what is the SCAS? Is it this?
Yeah.
See, she's addressing both problems. What is the SCAS, and then is this? But this was actually only half of the participant. 6 of the 12 participants we put in this condition did not do anything. Like, in some of them with very little hesitation, like this woman, for example.
C5.
Like she's acting like she knows what a scask is. She grabs it and she moves it right away. Now, this was very puzzling to us. We were still hoping to have one or two of these, but like half of them doing this was very puzzling. What's going on? Do they not notice the problem? No, that's really not the case. If you look at the time that it takes them to like touch the object from the moment the instruction begins, you see there is a huge difference between the scask instruction and the previous three. It's very clear. And you don't actually need to run this kind of analysis to know this. You just look at this participant.
Scask and move it to C5.
He picks one object, he picks the other, he smiles, yet it doesn't repair, it just takes a chance, one of them. Okay? So that's not the case. Could it be the case that they don't care about the consequences of ignoring these problems? Well, to test for this, we had another set of participants, another 12, which did the same exact thing, but now there's only one object. So now the inference is much easier, right? So the consequences are much lower. And indeed, now almost nobody did a repair, only 1 of 12. You hear a non-word that you've never heard before. Notice that there is still the possibility that the confederate misspoke, but you still don't repair. But you see the difference. When there is a consequence there, a likely consequence, you do it more often. So again, that's not the case. In conclusion, on that, sometimes humans communicate faithfully, but sometimes they don't, even when it seems to be clearly needed. Now, why should you guys care about this? Well, I have a couple of points, I think, that speak to this. And that is perhaps what we observe in the lab now is a vestige of a primordial design. This is a wild shot, but if it were true, then it would be evidence that human communication started with low level of faithfulness and became more precise only later, something that I think would be very interesting to this conference. Another thing that could be interesting to this conference is the possibility that when we observe lots of noise in animal communication, I was fascinated. They were telling me that we throw away almost half of our data. Why? Well, because they're noisy. Well, perhaps what you're watching there is something real human. So perhaps, if this is true, we should stop discarding this bad data, but you should actually start using them and comparing them to the bad data of the humans, which you can get if you test them in proper laboratory conditions. And with this I'm done. Thanks you for your attention.